So in the last lesson we got as far as the Getting Started wizard in Forefront TMG, and so now we can just jump through this wizard as well. I'm going to go into the first section here for configuring the network settings. Now, as I said, I'm just doing a single network adapter installation of TMG in this case. Depending on how far you want to go with learning about TMG, you could do one of the other configurations with multiple interfaces if you like. And my IP address configuration is already fine, I don't need to change anything there. Okay, so nice simple network setup for this particular scenario. Let's have a look at the system settings next. I've made my TMG server a member of the domain, which can make some of the authentication settings a little bit easier to manage. That DNS suffix is in place, so there's nothing I need to change there either. Jump through and complete that. And finally, just the deployment options. And yes, I do want to use Microsoft Update to keep it up to date. For this, I'm not interested in either of these NIS or web protection scenarios. Again, if you want to learn more about TMG in depth, feel free to look into those settings. And whether you participate in the customer experience improvement program is really up to you. I'm going to say no in this particular case, and no again. Okay, so that configuration is complete, and because I'm not using this TMG for a forward proxy or outbound proxy for my network, I'm not interested in running the web access wizard at this point, so I'll just close that off. And next, what I want to do is look at the web publishing rules that can be configured here in the firewall policy for publishing Exchange Server remote access. So over here in the firewall policy tasks section over here, we've got this publish Exchange web client access. So I'm going to call my new rule Exchange 2010 remote access. Choose Exchange Server 2010 as the version. I want to publish Outlook Web Access in this case. Don't worry about these, we can actually go and add these additional services in once the rule is in place. Now you do have the option to publish a single web server or load balancer. Now I don't actually recommend that you choose a single website or load balancer in this case. You shouldn't, just a recommendation, you shouldn't, if you have multiple client access servers in your organization, even if they're behind their own hardware load balancer, it is typically better to use ISO for TMG for the actual load balancing of traffic that is coming through the TMG itself. Now, one of the reasons for that is because if you are publishing to directly to the load balancer itself, in some configurations all of the traffic may appear to be coming from a single source IP address, and maybe that can confuse the load balancing in some scenarios. It will not actually load balance the traffic across all available client access servers. So a server farm is usually a little bit better, even if you only have a single client access server. And we are going to use SSL to connect to the published web server, so that means that between the TMG server itself and the Exchange server that it's publishing, it will communicate over SSL rather than a non-secured connection, so that's what we prefer. The internal site name, in my case, is mail.exchangeserverpro.net. Now we get to configure the actual server farm itself. So at the moment I've got no server farms defined within TMG. Let's go ahead and create a new one. Call this Exchange 2010 CAS. Now we can add servers into this farm. Now if you only had one server, you would just add one server. If you've got more than one, then of course you add more than one in here. So my servers are SID EX1. Actually, what I'll do is actually look them up here. CDX2. These connectivity monitoring settings are fine, you can leave those as the defaults. And just click yes, which allows requests from the Forefront TMG itself to those selected servers to verify that connectivity is available, so it can tell when a server or service is up or down, and that helps it load balance the traffic only to the servers that are actually up and available at the time. Now the domain name that I'll be publishing is mail.exchangeserverpro.net. Your other options here are just to accept requests for any name, but you want to be more precise in your configuration and actually specify the domain names that the rule will accept the traffic for. And now we configure the web listener. So the web listener is just a little configuration object on the TMG, which basically defines an IP address, a port, a certificate, and some authentication settings as well. Now there's no listeners pre-configured, so again I need to create my new one, and I'll call this one Exchange 2010 Remote Access Listener. I'm going to require SSL for the client connections, so I'm going to enforce SSL, not allow the clients to make an unsecured connection to TMG. And next we just need to configure which networks the TMG will listen on. In a single home configuration, only the internal network is necessary. There's no point in selecting the external one. And now we need to configure a certificate. So just like when a client is connecting to the Exchange client access servers, when they're connecting to TMG, you need to have an SSL certificate configured on the TMG server. At the moment there are no certificates installed on this server. What we can do is take the certificate that is already in use on the Exchange servers and bring that across to TMG and use that one instead. So I'll just jump over to my client access server SID EX1, and what I'm going to do is export my Exchange certificate. Get rid of that file that was already there. And now we'll just copy that across to the TMG. The reason I'm using the same certificate as is installed on my client access servers is because it will have that mail.exchangeserverpro.name already in it. Now, as possibly a downside to that, it also has my internal server names in it and some of the other names that perhaps aren't required for connections that the TMG will be handling. So some people don't like this. They think that exposing those names to the outside world, because anyone can just view the certificate and see the server names that are configured on it, is a security risk. That may well be true, and it may be more or less of a concern depending on the level of security requirement in your particular environment. In this test lab scenario, it's fine to continue using the same certificate that is installed on Exchange, but perhaps in the real world you may consider provisioning a separate certificate that only has the external facing names on it and using that one on the TMG server. Now we do need to import that certificate into the local certificate store, so I'll just launch MMC and do that as well. So just add the certificate snap in bound to the computer account, the local computer. That's fine, and we want to import that certificate. And then I'll copy it over to my downloads folder. There it is. Enter the password. I'll mark it as exportable just in case. And we're dropping it into the personal store there. That was successful. So now let's go back to that TMG wizard, and we can see that the certificate mail.exchangeserverpro.net we just installed is now available. Now, if I chose to show only valid certificates, if this certificate wasn't valid for use in this scenario, it may disappear from that list. Now, I want my clients that are connecting to TMG to use the HTML form authentication, so TMG will present an Outlook Web Access style forms-based logon. And we'll just configure SSO as well for the Exchange Server Pro. .exchangeserverpro.net domain. Okay, so there's my web listener all configured, listening on the internal network, only on SSL with the mail.exchangeserverpro.net certificate, and it will accept forms-based authentication and check those credentials against Active Directory. Next is the authentication delegation settings. So this is how Forefront TMG will actually make the authentication request to the client access server itself. And you can see here that you can pick basic, Kerberos, NTLM and so forth. Now, the trick with this is that you want to make sure you choose an authentication setting that matches the configuration on the client access servers themselves. So I'll pick basic in this case because basic is the correct setting if you're going to publish all of the remote access services through one publishing rule. So that's Outlook Web Access, ActiveSync, Outlook Anywhere, and so on. If they're all going to be through one TMG rule, then basic authentication delegation is the correct setting. And we want to allow all authenticated users through. Now, before I apply that rule, I can run a quick test. So let's fire up that test now and just see what happens. Okay, now that rule test has failed. Let's have a look at why. So when both the servers were tested, when it got to the Outlook Web Access or /OWA virtual directory, we have error details down here that tell us that the authentication delegation method defined in the rule does not match the authentication method selected for the published directory. So we have basic authentication configured in the web publishing rule, and as I was saying, we need to see basic authentication on the client access server as well. So let's jump over to the client access server CDX1 and have a look at what that Outlook web app security is set to. And it's currently set to forms-based authentication. So in an earlier lesson when we were looking at configuring Outlook web app, forms-based authentication was what we used. But now that we're looking at publishing it through the TMG, we want to be able to delegate that authentication. We need to switch over to one of the more standard authentication methods and make sure that basic is enabled. And we can in this case also enable integrated Windows authentication. So I'll make those changes to both of my client access servers. And as you're probably used to by now, these changes will require IIS to be restarted. So we need to match settings on the Exchange control panel as well. I'll restart IIS. Okay, and if you've got multiple client access servers as I do, just make sure you go ahead and do the same for the other one as well. Okay, I've made the change on both client access servers in my test lab, so I'm going to rerun that test and just see if I get an improved result. And this time all green ticks are indicating success. So now that the authentication settings match and all the other settings line up as well, that test is successful. So with confidence now we can finish that wizard and finally apply the new rule. Now I've switched over to my domain controller and I'm going to edit the DNS record in my internal zone exchangeserverpro.net for the host record for mail. So at the moment mail points to 192.168.102.10. I'll just look up the IP address of my firewall, my TMG server. Okay, so that's 192.168.102.5. So let's update that record. And now switch over to one of my client computers and just open up a web browser. In fact, before I go any further, I'll just verify that that updated DNS record has taken effect. Okay, so that's resolving now to the new IP address I set, 192.168.102.5, which is the IP address of the TMG server. So now if we go to mail.exchangeserverpro.net/OWA, we get a chance to log on. And that was successful. Now really nothing looked different there. The forms-based logon page looked the same. Once we get into Outlook web app itself, it looks the same as before. So how do we know that that's actually worked? I'll jump back over to the firewall, and what we can do is go to the logs and report page, and I'll just edit the filter here and change this for the last hour, and look for hits on the rule that I configured for Exchange 2010 remote access. I'll add that to the list. Just run that query, see what comes back, and there we can see the hits on that rule from 192.168.102.30 and 192.168.102.30 is the IP address of this client machine. So we can tell from those firewall logs that those hits did occur. So it looks like DNS is pointing at the TMG. It's publishing Outlook Web Access successfully. In the next video we'll just go into some of the additional configurations that can be applied to that rule as well.